The most important resource in a modern society is going to be energy. Energy is what enables us to trade and communicate across the globe on a smaller scale. It keeps the lights on and the house is warm. It even lets people get to work from distances that otherwise they simply would not be able to. Our entire modern society is propped up by our usage of energy, and no energy resource is more valuable to our society than petro energy. Since our societies are so reliant on oil and gas, not only as a resource, but also as an economic incentive, especially in Canada, it causes us to participate in what is known as a petroculture. And a petroculture is essentially just our society and culture in general being defined by our relationship to oil. It is what enables us to live the lives that we do today, and in doing so, it becomes central to our way of life. Now, big oil companies obviously have the incentive to make a profit. That is going to be their main economic goal, but their social goals are going to be to promote oil and gas. If the public perceives oil and gas positively, then it is going to be a lot easier to make a profit of it, and people are just going to be more accepting of it. So that leads to the question of this video, which is that petroculture sentiment is propagated through modern film, and in doing so, does it discourage greener alternatives through public dissent? Another concept that's important to understand when talking about petroculture is the idea of modernity, which is essentially just what it means to be modern. And according to Sesman and Boyer, modernity and energy are directly related, as we are reliant on our energy to actually be modern. Along the rising sentiment of petroculture and modernity comes this perspective of viewing the earth as a resource instead of the planet that we all live on. And when you're looking at the world as individual materials that can be exploited for profit, then you start to ignore things like pollution or people who may be living in those areas and how their quality of life may be affected. So this one perspective of the petroculture, which is entirely defined by profit and the ways that we can benefit from extracting resources from the planet, is then met with an opposite perspective of the people who are actually responsible for getting those resources. Take Venezuela, for example, where 95% of its exports are oil and gas, so it is very much a petroculture society, but the people who participate within it may have a very different outcome. And the documentary of Pozo Muerte does a very good job at explaining how these oil and gas companies will come into these areas, they'll make it look nice and pretty while they're there, they'll do a bunch of advertising to get people into the area to come work there, it looks super appetizing, but once all the oil and gas have actually been, depleted, the resource has been got, they just uproot from these areas and they leave these ghost communities, which now have nothing in return except for a destroyed environment. These oil and gas companies are perfectly aware of the negative effects that they are having on these local communities and the environment as a whole, and because of this, they use intentionally misleading language to greenwash themselves as advocates for a better and brighter future, even framing themselves as the front runners of it in certain examples. And in doing so, not only are they maintaining our petroculture society, but they're also discouraging greener alternatives, whether by saying they're not ready yet or they're just not as efficient as oil and gas. The bottom line is that in doing so, they are maintaining our petroculture, they are adding to the financial incentives of these oil and gas industries, and they're doing so by intentionally lying to people. We use the Spoiled documentary to show how oil and gas industries can be manipulative in their presentation of media, because this is a documentary which promises to expose the outright lies being spread about oil by the media, politicians, and environmental activists. And when you hear that at a first glance, it sounds like something that should be informational, it should be accurate, and it should tell you the truth about oil and gas. But if you were to do a little bit of research and look into the creation of this film, you would know that the maker of it, Mark Mathis, used to work at an independent petroleum association in New Mexico. And you would also know that a lot of the funding from this film comes from people who have vested interest in oil and gas. So all of a sudden, this documentary, which is supposed to be revealing the truth about oil and gas, now has people who work in the industry not only filming it, but also funding it. So it makes you question the incentives and the motives of these individuals. Now, the average person isn't going to do that much research, if any research, before watching a film to find out the incentives that the creators or funders of it may have. So a lot of that misinformation that could slide into the film subtly is just going to be taken at face value by the average viewer. And this leads to the continued influence effect where someone has perceived misinformation that they, in their head, know as acceptable, they know as true. So even when they are presented with evidence that says otherwise, they continue to believe the misinformation. And this is one of the strongest tools of the oil and gas industry and why you see them so interested in investing in the films industry. Now that you kind of get the why and the how these oil and gas companies use film to promote themselves and petroculture sentiment, I want to talk about the direct involvement of Middle Eastern countries who, of course, are very much petroculture sentiment dominated in Western media. You're going to have, for example, the NBC Broadcasting Group being 60% owned by the Saudi Arabian government. You're going to have the PIF having a 6% stake in Live Nation in 2020 from nearly $500 million. You're going to have Dubai paying $1.5 billion for up to a 3% stake in the Sony Corporation. And just to really hammer home the relevance of this issue, while I was editing for this video, you had Paramount launching a hostile bid to take over Warner Brothers. If you don't know, Netflix has been trying to acquire Warner Brothers. Now, Paramount is going to try to acquire them with $24 billion in funding from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Abu Dhabi. Obviously, they're also putting in a significant portion of money themselves, but that should be very evident that this is something that is happening in our mainstream media today. This isn't an issue of the past, and this isn't an issue with smaller news sources. This is ingrained in our culture at this point. And I think a great modern film to showcase how petroculture sentiment can be imbued in media without people even realizing it is Mad Max Furiosa. Now, this is a post-apocalyptic world where society as we know it has collapsed. The rules of operations are completely different than they are in modern times, and the most valuable resources now are things like food and water, bullets, and of course, oil and gas. Oil and gas is still central to this movie's plot, and the cars are also very important to this movie's plot. They act as a major spectacle for the audience. They're a major selling point to get people in seats, but they're also subtly promoting petroculture. Like, even in this dystopian world where everything is completely different, we are still entirely reliant on oil and gas. That still defines us, how we are able to transport ourselves, how we fight, because they're using the cars to fight in this case. And it just manipulates our worldview into accepting that oil and gas is just something that we rely on and will always rely on. The main takeaway of this video is that oil-rich countries and companies benefit from maintaining our petroculture society, and they do so through investment into our films and media industries. Whether it's having a significant number of shares or directly funding a film, oil and gas companies use deceptive and sneaky language to frame themselves not only as advocates for a greener future, but frontrunners for that better world. Since the average person is not going to do more research into environmental topics to clear up these misconceptions, they are just going to be propagated more and more in our society to the point where greener alternatives become frowned upon by the general public. The oil and gas industry uses film as a tool to reframe itself, hiding its negative assumptions while exemplifying the faults of alternatives, cementing itself as the ultimate good guy and the unavoidable backbone of our society.